Chapter 6. The Journey to Elderwood. Elderwood Grove was not marked on most maps, which, in Elara's opinion, was both an oversight and a mercy. The ancient forest didn't like being mapped. Or named. Or, frankly, acknowledged by anyone without at least 3 protective enchantments and a working knowledge of tree diplomacy. Which was why, naturally, the council had requested Elara go there immediately. "You're the most qualified," Archmage Helena had said through the scrying orb, with a tone that suggested Elara was being handed both a compliment and a bureaucratic hand grenade. The grimoire of binding hasn't been seen since the Second Arcane War. And recent Veil activity suggests it's waking up. And waking up magical grimoires is always such a soothing experience, Elara had muttered, sipping her 4th cup of caffeinated spell tonic. "I'm sending you coordinates," Helena had continued, ignoring her. "Take whoever you trust most. And for the god's sake, try not to provoke the trees this time." Elara had pointedly not promised that. Now, 3 days later, she and Rowan stood at the edge of a path that wasn't quite a path, looking up at branches so ancient they creaked with the weight of memory. The air smelled like damp moss, petrichor, and the faintest trace of ozone, magic, old and wild, the kind that didn't care for robes or titles. Rowan adjusted the strap of his satchel and glanced at her, his ears flicking like tiny weather vanes. "So," he said, mildly, "what are the odds we'll survive this without getting hexed by a sentient shrub?" Elara squinted at a particularly gnarled oak that appeared to be judging her outfit. "I'd say 60-40. 70-30 if you don't make fun of the flora." He snorted. "Noted. No mocking the shrubbery, even if it looks like it wants to unionize. Especially then." They stepped into the grove together, passing through an invisible threshold that felt like plunging into deep water, not suffocating, but immersive. The moment they crossed the boundary, the sounds of the outside world vanished. No birdsong. No wind. Just the rhythmic hush of their boots against moss, and the quiet hum of the forest watching them. Rowan was unusually quiet as they walked. Elara noticed. She always noticed. "You're thinking too loudly again," she said, sidestepping a route that definitely hadn't been there a moment ago. He gave her a sideways glance. "Sorry. Just, something about this place feels familiar." "That's likely the forest imprinting on your aura. Ancient groves have a tendency to resonate with shifter magic." "No," he said slowly. "It's not the magic. It's the silence. It reminds me of before." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. Elara reached for his hand without thinking, threading their fingers together like it was the most natural thing in the world, which, for her, it very much wasn't. But with Rowan, physical contact was never an intrusion. It was an anchor. He gave her a small smile. "You're fussing." "I am not. You cast a warmth charm on my jacket." "It's chilly," she said primly. "It's 62 degrees. She gave him a look. "Don't you dare start quoting weather patterns. I trained under a storm mage. I know chilly." He chuckled and let it go. But the smile stayed, and she counted it as a small victory against the weight he carried in his silences. The deeper they walked, the more the forest changed. The trees grew taller, impossibly so, their trunks wide enough to house stairwells and their branches knitting into canopies that filtered light into shades of emerald and gold. Occasionally, glowing moths drifted past like sentient snowflakes, and once, they passed a brook that whispered in rhyme. Rowan crouched by it, cupped a handful of water, and let it trickle through his fingers. "It's speaking in Old Sylvan," he said, brow furrowing. "Something about longing and return." Elara's spine stiffened. "That's a memory stream." He looked up at her. "Water like that only appears where emotional magic has pooled over centuries," she explained. "It doesn't flow the way we understand it. It remembers." Rowan stared into the stream for a long moment, then dipped his fingers again. "Do you think it remembers me?" Elara stepped beside him, watched as the water shimmered faintly around his hand, refracting his reflection into 3 overlapping faces: child, boy, man. "I think," she said softly, "the forest sees you more clearly than you see yourself." He didn't respond right away. "Then, that's not comforting." "Good," she replied. "You shouldn't be comforted. You should be curious." He grinned. "That's your answer to everything." Curiosity is 70% of successful magic. And the other 30? Panic. And a decent set of enchanted boots. By late afternoon, they reached the grove's heart. The clearing opened like a breath, lush and quiet, ringed by trees that hummed with so much ancient power it made the skin on Elara's arms tingle. At the center stood a stone dais, draped in moss and faintly glowing with binding runes. Rowan immediately tensed. There's something wrong here. She felt it too. Not danger, exactly, but dissonance. The magic here wasn't just old. It was restrained. Bound tightly, like something underneath was still very much alive and not entirely thrilled about being so. Elara stepped forward carefully, extending a hand toward the dais. Her magic met resistance, an intelligent pulse that recognized her. Not just her power, but her soul signature. Her past. The runes flared once, then dimmed. Elara, Rowan said behind her, voice low. There's a name etched here. In the stone. She turned. He stepped aside, letting her see. At the edge of the dais, half covered in moss, was a single name, carved in the old language. Elara. She stared at it, her heart thudding loud enough to drown out the trees. Elara the Flame-Bearer. Her possible past incarnation. The legend she had studied, dismissed, feared. The forest had brought her here for a reason. And suddenly, she wasn't sure whether she had come to claim the grimoire, or to remember who she had once been. By twilight, the clearing had begun to breathe. Not literally, of course, though in Elderwood Grove, Elara wouldn't put it past the flora, but the magic had shifted. What had been watchful and knotted with protective tension now felt receptive. As if the forest, after scrutinizing them through a million sentient leaves, had exhaled and decided fine, you may stay for now. Which was practically a love letter, by Elderwood standards. Rowan had set up a perimeter ward using sunstone anchors and her portable distortion screen. He wasn't technically licensed to do half of what he'd just performed, but, Elara thought as she watched him fine-tune the sigil placement with the precision of a battle mage, it was very difficult to care about licensing when the person in question moved like magic belonged to him. She sat beneath the roots of the skyroot tree, a towering behemoth that curled toward the sky in spiraling arcs of silver bark and deep green, its canopy glowing faintly with bioluminescent blossoms. Its roots arched like cathedral vaults, hollowed by time and tangled into natural alcoves that felt curiously like invitations. Rowan joined her without a word, sliding down beside her with practiced ease and resting his arms on his bent knees. His coat was dusted with flecks of moss, and his hair looked like it had argued with a vine and lost. "You have a leaf in your ear," she said, reaching out before he could dodge. He stilled. She plucked it free, fingers brushing the soft edge of his ear, and maybe, just for a second, lingered. "You know," he said, very softly, "for someone who once claimed she had zero maternal instincts, you fuss like someone's twice-great-grandmother." "That was one time," she replied. "And you had frostbite. On your tail." Still undignified. "I healed it, didn't I? After teasing me mercilessly." "Correction, I teased you gently and only after verifying your vitals." He smiled, slow and warm, and it hit her in the sternum like a poorly timed vulnerability spell. Which, unfortunately, was how most of his smiles landed these days. They lapsed into silence. Not uncomfortable. Not even particularly quiet, not with the forest murmuring around them, leaves rustling like whispered lullabies, and somewhere in the distance, a night beast singing a haunting trill that made the hair on Elara's arms rise. "You didn't tell me," Rowan said eventually. She blinked. "Didn't tell you what?" "That the grimoire was connected to your past incarnation." She hesitated. "It's not confirmed," she said carefully. "The legends are vague. And even if it was mine in another life, that doesn't mean I can, or should, claim it now." "But it recognized you," he said. The magic responded. "That happens with echoes," she said, trying not to sound defensive. "Resonant frequencies. Magical pattern recognition. It's more physics than fate." Rowan tilted his head, his golden eyes sharp and gentle at once. "You're deflecting." "I am. It's a deeply honed skill. I noticed," he said dryly. "You deflect when you're scared. And you're rarely scared." She looked at him then. Really looked. He was leaning back against the root arch, legs stretched out, hands folded over his stomach, but everything about his posture screamed alertness. His tail curled lightly around his ankle, a casual gesture that somehow made her chest ache. "You think I'm afraid of being powerful," she said. "I think," he said slowly, "you're afraid of what power asks from you. What it costs." The words sat between them like truth wrapped in velvet. She turned her gaze skyward, watching the soft glow of the blossoms ripple through the branches above. "Do you know what I remember most about growing up in the consortium?" He waited. "The quiet," she said. "The kind that felt like a punishment. I was always surrounded by books, by magic, by voices telling me how extraordinary I was. But never close. Never warm. Power didn't come with companionship. It came with glass walls and titles I didn't ask for." He shifted slightly closer. "I learned to isolate because it was expected. Safer. Easier. But then you came in, grinning, starving, wrecking my pantry, and suddenly I was burning my carefully constructed solitude for soup. For one dumb, wonderful boy who asked if I had a spoon preference." Rowan was very still. "I do have a spoon preference," she muttered. "But that's not the point." He reached for her hand. This time, when their fingers laced together, it felt less like warmth and more like gravity. "I know I'm not your past," he said. "I'm not part of the legends or the council or whatever this old grimoire wants from you." She opened her mouth. He squeezed her hand. "Let me finish." She closed it. "I'm just me. And I'm going to get older. I'm going to keep growing, and fighting, and maybe figuring out who I really am. And I want to do all of that with you. Not because I want to be part of your legacy, but because I want to be part of your life." Her breath caught. Not because it was unexpected, but because it wasn't. Because she'd known. She'd felt it for weeks, maybe longer, threading between all their late-night walks and arguments about potion labeling and the way he always stood between her and danger without thinking twice. "I can't give you a simple life," she said. "I'm a werewolf raised in a forest by trauma," he said. "I don't want simple." "You'll grow," she said. "You'll change. You might." "Love you anyway," he interrupted. Her heart stuttered. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper now. "I already do." For once, she didn't reach for a clever line. For once, she let the silence hold. And then, very softly, very deliberately, she kissed him. It wasn't dramatic. There were no glowing runes or orchestral thunderclaps. Just her mouth against his, warm and real, her fingers threading through his hair as his arms curled around her like he'd been waiting his whole life to do it. Above them, the blossoms glowed brighter. The forest held its breath. And Elara Archmage, legend, flamebearer, let herself fall, not into danger, but into something far more terrifying. Trust. Chapter 7, The Wolf's True Name. The ruins smelled like ash and something older than wood smoke, older than stone. The kind of smell that settled in the back of the throat and made you think of things you'd never lived through, but somehow remembered anyway. Rowan stiffened the moment they crossed the ridge. Elara noticed. She always noticed. They had been walking in silence since sunrise, the trail sloping sharply downward through the Rimefang Hills and into a basin of shattered architecture. Remnants of stone arches clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. Vines choked what used to be a great hall, and the wind whistled through broken mosaics that hinted at a grandeur long decayed. She stepped closer to him. "Rowan?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on something ahead, something half buried under rubble and shadow. Elara followed his gaze. At the base of a cracked obsidian pillar stood a carving. Time had worn it down, but the etching was unmistakable, a wolf encircled by flame. Stylized, aggressive, and distinctly not of modern heraldry. She frowned. "That's a tribal crest." His voice, when it came, was barely audible. "I've seen it before." Elara turned to him. Rowan's jaw was tight, shoulders rigid, golden eyes flickering with something unsteady. "There was a place. Years ago. Before Frostspire. Before I could name what I was. I wandered too far south. Got caught in a storm. And I stumbled across a cave. The same symbol was on the wall." She didn't interrupt. "I thought I imagined it," he said. Or that I'd walked into someone else's dream. Elara stepped forward, tracing the edge of the crest with her gloved fingertips. This symbol hasn't been used since the early Veil Wars. The Flame Wolf clans were thought to be extinct or absorbed into the greater Silverfang lines. He gave her a wry smile. Maybe I'm just historically inconvenient. She smiled back. But her mind was spinning. Because the symbol wasn't just decorative. It pulsed faintly with lingering magic, the kind that clung to bloodlines. And Rowan's presence, his proximity, was activating it. Stand closer, she said. He obeyed, cautiously. The symbol flared. Not violently. Not even brightly. Just a soft, humming glow, like a candle that had been waiting a long time for its match. Rowan stared at it. That's not a good sign, is it? That depends on your perspective, Elara murmured. It's a blood key. Very old. Very specific. It only responds to direct descendants. He looked at her, 1,000 questions flickering across his face in rapid succession. Elara, he said, voice taut with barely restrained panic, what are you telling me? She exhaled slowly. I think this ruin belonged to your people. Possibly your family. Which means you're not just a random orphan who stumbled through the world until he found a witch with a taste for sarcasm and soup. I make excellent soup. You do, she agreed. But this is legacy-level soup quality. Rowan sat down heavily on a chunk of broken marble. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it buzzed. Like static before a storm. I never wanted to be special, he said eventually. Not like this. I know. I wanted to be enough for you, for myself, for the version of me I was trying to build. But I didn't want a prophecy. Or a forgotten title. Or this weird sense of obligation I can already feel trying to creep up the back of my spine. She sat beside him. Being important doesn't mean you owe the world everything it demands, she said. And it sure as hell doesn't mean you stop being yours first. He looked at her, golden eyes softer now. I'm afraid, he admitted. Not of the truth. Of what it means. Of who I was. Who I might have to be. You don't have to be anything but who you are now, she said. Rowan Fenwick. Apprentice werewolf. Reluctant assistant. My favorite source of domestic chaos. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. She reached out and touched his hand. You don't have to carry this alone. I know. But there was something else in his expression. Something deeper. Elara, he said slowly, what if the cult's after me not just because I'm beastkin, but because I'm from this line? Because I'm the only one left who can open something they need? She stiffened. It was a fair question. A dangerous one. And suddenly, all the pieces, the rituals, the symbols, the veiled references to the vessel slotted into a shape that made her stomach twist. Then we make sure they never get the chance, she said. We find out what they want. We find it first. And then we bury it so deep no one can ever unearth it again. Rowan's voice was low. Even if it means burying part of me. She didn't flinch. If it's a part that hurts you, yes. He looked down at their hands. You're always willing to protect me. She shrugged. I'm terrible at most things. But protecting you? That's easy. He met her eyes. And this time, when he smiled, it reached all the way to the edges. The invitation arrived in the form of a messenger hawk. Which was, in Elara's professional opinion, far too dramatic a medium for something that amounted to a royal summons. The bird landed on their campsite's perimeter ward like it knew it was carrying generational trauma and pecked twice impatiently at Rowan's shoulder before Elara could intercept. The scroll it carried was sealed in deep crimson wax, imprinted with a crest that matched the flame wolf sigil they discovered in the ruins. Rowan stared at it for a full minute before opening it. He read it silently. Then again, slower. Elara waited, watching the subtle shifts in his expression, the minute tightening of his jaw, the way his shoulders pulled back in that soldier-stiff posture she had started to hate for how well it fit him. His alive, Rowan said at last, voice unreadable. My father. She didn't say anything. She waited. He's the last surviving alpha of the Flame Wolf bloodline. The others were wiped out during the Veil War. He went into hiding deep, old-world territory and formed something like a shadow tribe. Hidden. Isolated. Waiting. Waiting for what? She asked quietly. Rowan folded the scroll, careful, precise. Me. It should have been a victory. Instead, Elara felt a knot forming beneath her sternum. Not from jealousy, though if she were being honest, maybe a sliver of it. Not even from fear of losing him. But from the awful, hollow certainty that came with watching someone you love discover the one thing they thought they'd stopped hoping for. You should go, she said after a moment. His head snapped toward her. What? You should meet him, she said, as calmly as if she were discussing lecture assignments. See what's there. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's everything. But you've wondered your entire life if someone out there wanted you. If there's a place you belonged before all of this. He looked at her like she'd offered him poison in a teacup. I do belong, he said. Here. With you. I know, she said, and meant it. But sometimes it's not about where you end up. It's about seeing what could have been so it doesn't keep haunting you. He didn't answer. But that night, he didn't sleep. And by dawn, he was gone. She didn't follow. Not immediately. Not because she didn't want to gods, every part of her ached to, but because she respected him enough to give him space to find whatever version of truth he was searching for. And because she trusted him to come back. Or at least, she wanted to trust that. She spent the next 3 days at the academy, restocking her arcane supplies, catching up on council reports, and deliberately not checking the maps for werewolf border sightings or trail markers from the eastern tribes. Josie noticed, of course. Josie noticed everything. He'll come back, she said while helping Elara enchant a floating chalkboard that refused to stop spelling insults in Old Draconic. He's basically obsessed with you. That's not comforting, Elara muttered. Maybe not. But it's true. Also, you talk about him in your sleep. Elara dropped her chalk. I absolutely do not. You muttered don't touch the soup spoon, it's enchanted, and then blushed. Again, not proof. Totally proof. When he returned, it was without warning. 1 minute, Elara was elbow deep in an unstable pocket dimension she was attempting to seal in the west corridor. The next, she turned, and there he was. Leaner, rougher around the edges, his cloak torn, his boots muddy, and his expression entirely unreadable. He didn't speak. Neither did she. She waited. I met him, Rowan said, voice hoarse. My father. Elara straightened slowly. And? His powerful. Cold. Regretful, but not in a way that changes anything. He says he didn't look for me because the tribe needed protecting, and any trace of his bloodline could have drawn the cult's attention. Do you believe him? I believe he believes it, Rowan said. But it doesn't change the fact that he let me starve. That he let me suffer, alone, because he thought it served a higher purpose. She exhaled. And he offered me a place, Rowan added. In the Flame Wolf Enclave. A rank. A title. A future. Elara's throat tightened. And? I said no. She blinked. You what? I thanked him, Rowan said, stepping closer. And I said no. Because a future without you in it doesn't interest me. Her breath caught. I have a name now. A legacy. But I also have a choice, he said. And I choose you. You don't have to, she whispered, because her defenses were old and worn and still too reflexive. I want to, he said. Because the person I am with you is the only version of me I've ever actually liked. She didn't realize she was crying until he reached out, gently brushed his thumb under her eye, and smiled like every war-torn piece of his soul had just remembered how to be whole. You once said I wasn't alone, he murmured. Let me say it back. You're not alone either, Elara. Not anymore. This time, she didn't try to argue. She just stepped into his arms, held him like the answer to every question she hadn't dared ask, and let herself believe, for the first time in a very long time, that home was not a tower, or a title, or a distant future etched in magic. It was him. And he had chosen to stay. Chapter 8. The Siege of Shadows. It began, as so many catastrophes did, with a stolen child and a spell too old to be in circulation. Elara stood at the edge of the scrying pool, eyes fixed on the glowing map of Aetheris. Dozens of points pulsed like anxious heartbeats, but only one was flaring red, a fishing village on the southeastern coast, where the ley line converged awkwardly with a historical fault line and a disused temple to the forgotten gods. She hated when geography aligned with apocalyptic potential. They've accelerated, Elara said quietly, adjusting her glasses as the data fed into the Academy's main arcane index. Multiple disappearances. Mostly beastkin children. The abductions are more precise. Less messy. They're refining the ritual, Warren added. He didn't look up from his sword, which he was methodically oiling as if preparing for a battle he already knew was inevitable. Josie's expression was unusually serious. The runes found at the last site match the ones from the blood crest Rowan triggered. That's not coincidence. No, Elara said. It's strategy. She stepped back from the scrying pool, robes swishing, and turned to face her students and her assistant, who, to his credit, was standing remarkably still for someone who had just learned his ancestral bloodline might be the cult's final missing ingredient in their resurrection spell. Rowan met her gaze. They want me. Yes, she said evenly. Or rather, they want what your blood opens. He crossed his arms. Which makes me the key. Or the weapon. No, she corrected. It makes you the target. And that means we plan accordingly. She was proud of how steady her voice sounded. Proud of how she didn't glance down or waver or slip into the protective tone she had learned to use when Rowan was smaller and more afraid of his own shadow than of cults trying to rewrite reality. But he wasn't that boy anymore. He was taller now. Stronger. Sharper. And heartbreakingly brave. We can't wait for the council, Elara said. Even if they approve mobilization, it'll take too long. They're too busy arguing over whether the forgotten gods constitute a divine threat or a political inconvenience, Josie added, sounding disgusted. Warren's sword gave a final, metallic hum as he slid it into the sheath. Then we don't wait. We act. Elara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to the center of the chamber, where the tactical map had shifted into a three-dimensional projection of the ritual sites, connected by a jagged crimson web. It looked disturbingly like a snare. They're weaving the veil apart from the inside, she said. Every child they take is a stitch pulled loose. Every site they activate is another anchor point for the god they're trying to bring through. Rowan moved beside her. Then we cut the threads before the web finishes forming. She looked up at him. He looked ready. Not just trained, or skilled, or willing. But ready in the way people rarely were before it was too late. Like he'd been holding his fear in one hand and his love in the other and finally decided which one deserved more of his strength. Elara, he said quietly, we can't keep playing defense. She swallowed. He was right. And stars help her, she didn't want to send him into danger. But she hadn't raised him to sit quietly on the sidelines. She had raised him to choose. To fight. Then we take the fight to them, she said. But not alone. The call went out across Aetheris. Not through formal channels. Not through the bureaucratic mess of the Arcanum or the politicking of the Mage's Council. Elara used the old ways, sigils written in skyfire, names whispered into the wind, ancient channels that hadn't been activated since the last time the world flirted with collapse. She summoned allies. Former rivals. Other archmages who owed her favors and debts and questionable allegiances. And they came. Orion Vale appeared first, dramatically as always, descending from the sky on a platform of controlled storm clouds with his hair perfectly wind-swept and a cup of coffee in hand. Did someone say world-ending prophecy and questionable cult activity? I brought scones. Clarice Emberfall shimmered in next, draped in crimson robes that smelled faintly of cinnamon and danger. I assume this is the sort of mission where ethics are optional and dramatic spells are encouraged. Yes, Elara said. And thank you for dressing for the occasion. By nightfall, 5 archmages had gathered in the ancient war chamber at the Academy, each with different methods, temperaments, and moral alignment, but all united by one simple fact: they trusted Elara more than they trusted the council. That, and she made a compelling argument when the world was on the brink of divine collapse. Where's the boy? Drogon Stormclaw asked, peering over the edge of his bone-carved staff. The one who keeps breaking magical diagnostics just by existing. He's preparing the students, Elara said, then added, and he's not a boy. He's a warrior. And he's ready. A soft knock interrupted them. Rowan entered. And for a moment, no one spoke. He was dressed in reinforced mage leathers, tailored to his build but enchanted at the seams with silver threading and woven protection glyphs. His posture was confident, his eyes steady, his wolf ears alert, not submissive, not defensive. Present. Acknowledged. Elara's heart did something unscientific and deeply inconvenient. We ride at dawn, she said, tearing her eyes away. To the cult's primary convergence site near the dead veins. They're close to completing the ritual. And what happens when we get there? Orion asked. Elara looked at Rowan. And Rowan, the stray who had once flinched at shadows and now stood like a storm waiting to break, met her eyes. Then we show them, he said, voice low and sure, what happens when you try to steal children from a wolf. The night before the battle, the air held its breath. The camp was quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet that meant safety, but the solemn, deliberate hush of people who knew the world would not be the same come morning. The kind of silence that sharpened the edges of every heartbeat and made conversations feel heavier, even when spoken softly. Elara stood at the edge of the cliff overlooking the dead veins, a jagged wasteland where the ley line fractured like broken glass beneath the earth. It was not a place meant for life. Magic here buzzed unsteadily, disrupted and aggressive, humming against her skin like static electricity searching for a discharge point. She was trying not to think about what would happen if they lost. Behind her, footsteps crunched softly against the weathered stone. I thought I'd find you here, Rowan said, voice low but familiar in the best possible way, like her name spoken in a language only they understood. I'm not sulking, she said, though she sort of was. I didn't say you were. You were thinking it. He stepped beside her, folding his arms across his chest. The wind tousled his hair, which had grown slightly longer during the past few weeks, long enough to curl over his collar, wild enough to look like it refused to be tamed by anything other than possibly her fingers. She pretended not to stare. She failed. I keep going over it in my head, she admitted. The battle plan. The contingencies. Every possible variation of the ritual we could intercept. And it still doesn't feel like enough. It won't, Rowan said. Because you care. She snorted. Oh good. Empathy as a strategic weakness. That's comforting. It's not a weakness, he said, gaze steady. It's the reason we're going to win. She turned to him, brows raised. Really? You want to bet our odds of survival on me being a bleeding heart with a savior complex? I'd bet my life on it. Her heart did that thing again, lurching somewhere between affection and panic. Because this wasn't the sarcastic wolf boy who had once tried to reorganize her potion shelf by color. This was the man he'd become, shaped by fire and grief and kindness and everything in between. He took a step closer, and another, until they were separated only by the tension of breath and the weight of what neither of them had yet said aloud. You've always seen me, he said. Not as a threat, or a liability, or some magical wildcard you needed to fix. You looked at me when I had nothing to offer but hunger and fear, and you decided I was worth keeping. She opened her mouth, but he held up a hand. And I've followed you every day since. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because you are where I wanted to be. I'm not easy to love, Rowan, she said, voice too shaky for her liking. I'm cold, and obsessive, and emotionally constipated. My idea of romance is annotated research papers and aggressively brewed tea. I know, he said, with a crooked smile. And I still want you. She stared at him. You don't have to say it back, he added, softer now. I just needed you to know, in case tomorrow goes badly. In case I'm not. Don't, she said sharply. Don't talk like that. Elara. I mean it, she said, stepping forward, pressing her palms flat against his chest, where his heartbeat thudded strong and fast beneath the layers of cloth and leather and reckless bravery. I've spent most of my life losing people. And I never said goodbye the right way, because I was too busy pretending I didn't care. I do care. I care so much it makes me furious. I know, he whispered. I see it in everything you do. She looked up at him, into those gold-flecked eyes that had become the axis of her world, and let go of the last flimsy excuse keeping her from saying the one thing that had been lingering just beneath her tongue for weeks. "I love you," she said. "You infuriating, brilliant, brave idiot. I love you, and I don't want to imagine a world where you're not in it." His breath hitched. And then, finally, irrevocably, he kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't tentative. It was the kind of kiss that came from knowing someone inside out, from every look across a spell-riddled library to every quiet night shared over half-burnt stew. It was slow and deep and anchored in 100 moments of unspoken longing. She kissed him back like it was a language they'd both forgotten how to speak until now. When they pulled apart, slightly breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "You're still not allowed to die. I wasn't planning on it." "Good. Because I have plans for us," he said, smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Plans that involve a fireplace, your ridiculous slippers, and absolutely no impending divine doom." She laughed, and for one strange, perfect second, the world felt normal. Then the warning bell sounded, 3 low chimes that echoed like thunder across the valley. The cult was moving. The battle had begun. Rowan kissed her once more, quick and sure. Time to go save the world. Elara reached for her staff, her magic already rising like a tide beneath her skin. Side by side. He offered his hand. Always. Chapter 9, Light Beyond the Veil. There was no dawn. The sky above the dead veins had abandoned light entirely, swallowing it in a black-violet haze threaded with sickly gold. The sun hadn't risen so much as hesitated, caught in a suspended loop of pre-dawn twilight where shadows refused to recede. The veil pulsed visibly overhead, frayed, flickering, bleeding fragments of foreign stars like paper set too close to flame. Elara adjusted the cuffs of her spell-weave gloves and watched the horizon unravel. The battlefield stretched before her in warped symmetry, jagged obsidian ridges, cult-carved altars that hummed with summoning runes, and a single focal point in the center, an altar grown from bone and black crystal, rising like a thorn from the earth. It pulsed in time with the veil, radiating the same impossible rhythm. Soon. 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 Behind her, the army stirred. Or, well, the collection of morally flexible archmages, idealistic students, beastkin allies, and one aggressively enthusiastic mandragora who had followed her into what was probably classified as a Class A suicide mission with a 12% chance of divine annihilation. "Looks like they've activated the outer circle," Orion said, his usual theatrical energy subdued beneath a layer of grim calculation. "We'll need to sever those ley line anchors fast. Or they'll complete the resonance loop and rip open a corridor straight through the veil." Elara didn't respond right away. She was watching the cultists. Hundreds of them, robed in shifting silks that blurred the eye, each one moving like they weren't entirely tethered to this world. And at their center, masked figures began to chant, their voices weaving into something that wasn't quite language, more like intention rendered audible. Rowan stepped beside her, his presence grounding. He wore the armor Orion had enchanted the night before, flexible obsidian leather layered with defensive runes and silver-threaded sigils that glowed faintly over his heart. His tail flicked once, alert. His eyes never left hers. "We're ready," he said. "Say the word." She exhaled slowly and raised her staff. "Go." The battle began not with a roar, but with a resonance. Warren was the first to strike, leaping from the cliffside with his blade flaming blue, cleaving through the cult's outer defensive sigils like they were paper charms. Behind him, Josie and Elara cast synchronized arcane pulses that slammed into the left flank, scattering summoned wraiths before they could fully coalesce. Orion and Clorice took the air, raining down binding hexes and weather-warping magic. Clorice's flames hissed like serpents, Orion summoned twin lightning bolts that danced along the cultists' front line like a duet composed by vengeance and caffeine. Elara moved forward at a measured pace, each step laying a sigil into the earth, each gesture anchoring her team to the fabric of the realm. Her magic was ice and gravity, raw and elegant, every spell calculated, every strike surgical. And Rowan was everywhere. He moved like the storm she'd always suspected he would be, fast, intuitive, terrifyingly precise. He struck with claws and steel and strength that no longer asked permission from fear. When cultists reached for him, their illusions collapsed. When they tried to cage him with veil-born magic, He shredded their anchors with a snarl that made the world listen. Elara! Josie called out from across the battlefield, her shield sigil glowing with strain. They're forming a nexus near the altar. They're feeding the central node. Elara's eyes snapped to the center, where the summoning circle now glowed like a second sun, layered with runes she hadn't seen in centuries. Not just a ritual. Not just a portal. A conduit. They're not trying to bring something through, she realized aloud. They're trying to fuse it. Rowan landed beside her, breathing hard but steady. Fuse what? Guardhood, she said. They want to incarnate the Forgotten One inside a vessel. And the altar was already prepared. Her heart dropped. Rowan stilled. It's me. Isn't it? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He stepped forward, slowly, his breath fogging in the corrupted air. Then we stop them before they finish binding it. You are not stepping onto that altar, she said sharply. I'm not, he agreed, but I can bait the spell. Absolutely not. Elara. He touched her arm, firm and gentle. This is what we've trained for. All of it. Every nightmare. Every prophecy. Every argument about protective enchantments and their appropriate uses in kitchens. This is it. She hated him a little, in that moment. Mostly because he was right. Just buy me enough time, she whispered. I can unravel the summoning grid if I get close enough to the nexus. He grinned, despite the war behind them and the divine threat ahead. I'll give you all the time you need. And then he ran. Straight toward the altar. Straight into the heart of the ritual. The cultists saw him instantly. They surged like a wave, chanting louder, faster, hands raised toward the fraying veil, and Rowan leapt onto the stone dais with the kind of grace that only came from utter certainty in one's purpose. Light exploded. Spells cracked across the sky. And in the chaos, Elara ran too, staff blazing, heartbreaking, mind calculating 6 different collapse points in the spell matrix. She would save him. She would save them all. Elara hit the altar like a falling star. Her boots scraped stone, spells crashing around her in a lattice of precision magic and barely controlled panic. The summoning grid was half-formed, pulsing with old god resonance and stitched together with blood, bone, and something far worse, belief. It hummed under her feet like it knew her name, like it had been waiting centuries just to say hello. Rowan stood in the center, framed in golden light and chaos, breathing hard, bleeding from a shallow gash along his temple, and looking entirely too calm for someone standing on a divine fulcrum. You were supposed to stall them, she shouted over the rising wind. I am stalling them, he said, flashing her a grin. Very handsomely, I might add. She could have strangled him. Except that she loved him, and also, he was the only reason the altar hadn't consumed half the battlefield yet. Don't move, she warned, circling the edge of the platform, analyzing the etched runes now glowing red-hot beneath her. The binding's attuned to your bloodline. If you step off the convergence ring, it might collapse or, worse, complete the transfer. He winced. Can I move my eyebrows? Or is that also a risk to the fabric of reality? Only if you wiggle them suggestively. You say that like I haven't done it before in the middle of your lectures. She bit back a smile. Now is not the time for your terrible flirting. I object to that adjective. Elara, came Clarice's voice through the communication charm, crackling with static and heat. The grid's drawing power from the cultists now. They're offering themselves to fuel the summoning. You have minutes, maybe less. Elara's heart clenched. She could see it now, the way the spell had been structured like a layered equation, folded in on itself with recursive logic and sacrificial inputs. It wasn't a door. It was a fusion matrix. And it wasn't just looking for Rowan, it was accepting him. His blood. His magic. His identity. She had seconds to stop it. Elara, Rowan said, voice softer now. There's something you're not telling me. She didn't respond. Her hands were a blur of movement, drawing counter runes into the air, feeding them with her own magic. Her gloves smoldered. Her eyes burned. Elara. I figured it out 20 seconds ago, she said without turning. There's only one way to destabilize the binding core. Silence. Then, quietly, you mean one of us has to offer up a sacrifice in the same magical key. Correct. And since I'm the original key, you are not sacrificing yourself, she snapped. He stepped toward her. Rowan, don't. The ritual's attuned to me. I know. Then you know I'm the most effective counterbalance. She turned to face him, hands clenched at her sides. I didn't bring you all this way just to lose you on a technicality. His expression gentled. And I didn't survive all this just to let you throw yourself away trying to save me. You think I'm afraid of that? Her voice cracked. You think I haven't already decided I'd burn the world to keep you safe? His eyes softened. That's exactly why you can't. Because if you die for me, I won't survive it. But if I do this, if I choose to disrupt the spell by being its undoing, it's not death, Elara. It's freedom. No, she said, barely more than a whisper. Yes, he said, stepping fully into the center of the ring. The altar flared. Magic screamed. And then, he looked back at her. Just once. I love you, he said, clear and quiet, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. And Elara, who had rewritten spell theory, broken time loops, and outsmarted gods, felt something shatter in her chest. I love you too, she whispered. Then she did the only thing she could think to do. She ran toward him. He turned, startled, but she was already moving, casting a spell so ancient and so precise it burned straight through her veins. She reached the circle, shoved him backward with the force of her will and took his place. The altar screamed. Elara! Rowan roared, lunging for her. But it was too late. The spell collapsed inward, twisting on its own logic, destabilized by her substitution and the fact that she, not Rowan, was the contradiction it couldn't calculate. Because Elara wasn't a descendant of the flame wolf bloodline. She was the reincarnation of its end. The spell buckled, reversed, and exploded in a wave of blinding silver light. And then, silence. She awoke hours later, disoriented and aching and inexplicably cold. Someone was holding her. Elara? Rowan's voice cracked. Elara, please. She blinked. He was cradling her against his chest, armor charred, arms trembling, his entire body radiating a kind of fear she never wanted to see again. I'm okay, she rasped. He choked on a breath. You, Elara, you nearly. I reversed the polarity, she muttered, and overrode the ancestral identifier. Simple inversion calculus. You lied to me. I improvised. You almost died. She smiled faintly, eyes fluttering closed again. Worth it. He kissed her forehead, gently, like it was a promise. And when she slept again, it was without dreams. Chapter 10, Home is Where You Choose. Recovery, as it turned out, was far less glamorous than survival. Elara had expected triumph, maybe a little post-victory euphoria. Possibly wine. What she got instead was 2 cracked ribs, a mana depletion migraine that lasted 3 days, and strict orders from Clarice to remain in bed while the residual spell backlash worked its way out of her nervous system. Bed rest, Clarice had said, with the kind of stern finality usually reserved for sentencing war criminals. Absolutely no spellcasting, lecturing, world-saving, or enchanting of kitchen utensils. To which Elara had replied, I only enchanted the soup ladle once. Clarice had raised an eyebrow. It tried to assassinate the mandragora. That was an accident. Twice. Experimental autonomy is a slippery slope. Now, tucked under layers of magically temperature-regulated blankets and pretending not to be impressed by the softness of the pillow Rowan had snuck in from Frostspire, Elara lay in the infirmary wing of the Aurelian Academy with the general vibe of someone who was deeply uncomfortable being fussed over. Across from her, Rowan paced like a wolf denied the ability to hunt, fight, or be useful. He'd already fluffed her pillows. Twice. He had also tried to refill her water glass with healing elixir until Elara gently informed him that triple concentrated phoenix root was technically not lethal but also not encouraged. Elara opened one eye. You're vibrating again. I'm not. You are. If you move any faster, you'll form a temporary portal to the snack bar. Rowan folded his arms. You almost died, Elara. And now I'm not. Therefore, success. You lied to me about the spell. I strategically withheld information. You threw yourself into a collapsing fusion ritual in my place. Which, may I point out, worked. She tried a smile. We won. Rowan looked at her for a long moment, then crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed, his expression unreadable. Elara, he said quietly, don't you ever do that again. Something in his voice made her throat close. I couldn't let them take you, she said. And I couldn't lose you, he shot back, just as soft. I still can't. The silence between them was thick and fragile. He reached for her hand and, as always, she let him. His palm was warm, calloused, steady, the one place she had always felt tethered, no matter how close she danced to unraveling. She didn't tell him how close it had been. How her magic had almost snapped at the final moment. How the only reason she had survived was because he had anchored her from the outside, pouring so much raw emotion into the bond between them that her magic had rethreaded itself around his heartbeat. She suspected he knew anyway. You're being extremely soft, she murmured, mostly to distract them both. He smiled faintly. I'll be hard and grumpy again tomorrow. I'll hold you to that. The aftermath of the battle unraveled in slow, painstaking waves. The cult's network had shattered with the destruction of the summoning core. The children, all of them, were found alive, though weak, shielded within a sub-dimensional pocket the Order had created as a holding ward. Josie had cried openly when she helped them out, her arms full of trembling foxkin and elflings who clung to her like lifelines. The students returned to the academy with more scars than they had left, with some visible, some invisible, but also with a kind of quiet strength Elara hadn't expected. They moved differently now, with the weight of choices made and battles earned. Warren handed in a formal resignation from the reincarnated hero program, citing creative differences and an unwillingness to die again. Elara submitted a thesis on the predictive accuracy of veil-bound dream sequences. Josie organized a fundraiser to rebuild the damaged village near the dead veins, which inexplicably involved enchanted pastries and raised more gold than the council's official relief effort. As for Elara, she was offered the headmistress position of Aurelian. Twice. She declined both times, citing an allergy to administration and a preference for chaos on her own terms. The second time, she included a footnote that read, also, your library categorization system is a crime against spellcraft. She had bigger plans. On the fifth evening after the battle, Elara stepped carefully out onto the northern balcony of the tower, the city of Valewind sprawling below in silver mist and lantern light. Her robes were wrapped tight, her staff leaning within arm's reach, her heartbeat steadier than it had been in days. Rowan joined her without a word, handing her a cup of her favorite frost-laced tea. Are you planning to propose? She teased, sipping. Because I don't think I'm legally allowed to accept anything romantic while still wearing healing charms. I'll wait, he said, smiling softly. She looked at him, this boy now man who had once been all sharp edges and silent fear, and who now stood beside her like a promise she never thought she'd be allowed to keep. You found your past, she said. And gave it up. I didn't give it up, he said. I just chose my future. And me. You're the reason I have one. She didn't cry. Mostly because she was very proud and also still partially dehydrated. But her fingers tightened around his, and the rest of the world fell away. There would still be work. There would still be danger. The veil would need mending. The realms would shift. The council would meddle. But here, in this moment, with tea between them and stars above, Elara finally let herself believe in the kind of ending that wasn't the end at all, but the beginning of everything else. Frostspire had never been this warm. Not temperature-wise, it was still a tower carved into the northern cliffs and surrounded by perpetual snowdrifts, after all, but warm in a different way. The kind that lived in hearthlight and mismatched tea mugs and a certain wolf shifter boy humming off-key while cooking breakfast. It had been 3 weeks since the battle at the Dead Veins, and Elara was still adjusting to the strange, novel sensation of peace, a rare and slightly uncomfortable state for someone whose baseline had always hovered somewhere between mild crisis and full-blown catastrophe. She wandered through the atrium barefoot, letting the morning's subtle magic brush against her skin. The wards were steady now, pulsing softly in the walls. The scrying basin had gone dormant, no longer shrieking with alerts. Even the sentient coat rack had stopped trying to hex guests who tracked snow inside. Elara found Rowan in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair messily tied back, flipping something on the skillet that was very much not a standard breakfast item. "What is that?" she asked, blinking blearily and reaching for a mug that filled itself with frost-steeped black tea the moment her fingers touched it. "A fusion of pancakes and dumplings," he said, not looking up. "Working title, Dump Cakes." She gave him a long, pained look. "That's a war crime. You'll eat 3. Only out of morbid curiosity." Rowan turned, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "And because you like my cooking. I like you. Your cooking is a secondary benefit. That's not what you said about the frostberry tart I made last week. You threatened to withhold cuddling if I didn't say it was better than Clarice's." Semantics. She smiled into her mug. Gods, but she loved him. Not in the way she once thought love had to be burning, impossible, something you chased at the expense of yourself. No, this was steadier. Quieter. It lived in the way he poured tea before she even asked, the way his tail curled around her ankles when she stood too long at her desk, the way he never tried to fix her loneliness but instead sat with her in it, until it didn't feel so lonely anymore. After breakfast, yes, she ate 3, they went out to the courtyard. The snow here was different, lighter, kissed with residual magic. Rowan had reinforced the perimeter wards using his own enchantments, ones laced with wild, instinctive magic that pulsed harmoniously with hers. He called it cohabitational resonance. She called it adorably territorial. Today, he was building something new. At first, she thought it was another training ring. But as she stepped closer, she saw the bones of it: benches, curved rows, a protective dome overhead still in progress. "A classroom?" she asked, surprised. Rowan looked over his shoulder, brushing snow from his collar. "Sort of. More like a sanctuary. For beastkin. Transmigrants. Students who need magic but can't find a place that wants them." Elara's breath caught. "You built this?" "Mostly. Josie helped design the shielding array. Elira's lending us her old focus runes. I've been taking notes from your lectures." He paused. "I might have borrowed your old curriculum notes." She stared at him. "You want to teach?" He shrugged. "Not the way you do. But I want to make a space like you made for me, where someone can come in from the cold and not feel like they have to prove they deserve warmth." It wasn't fair, how he could say things like that without warning. Without armor. She stepped forward, arms around his waist before she realized she was moving. "You're going to be good at it," she said, voice muffled against his shoulder. "I had the best example," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. They stood like that for a while, the cold forgotten, the snow falling soft around them. Later, back inside, Elara found herself staring at the old desk in her tower library, the one that had once been her only company. The one she had eaten beside, studied beside, existed beside, in silence so long she'd mistaken it for safety. Now it was cluttered with 2 tea mugs, a half-finished lesson plan, and a wool scarf Rowan had accidentally set on fire during his attempt to enchant it with self-wrapping properties. She picked up the scarf, now mostly intact, and laughed. "I'm thinking," she said aloud, "we open it next week." The school. Rowan glanced up from the sofa, where he was rearranging a pile of texts into what she assumed was a filing system. "You're ready?" "I'm ready to try." She sat beside him. "Besides, if we wait for the world to be perfect, we'll die of boredom." He rested his head on her shoulder. "I like the world like this. Cozy and slightly chaotic." "Exactly." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the fire. Then Rowan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, glowing charm, silver and blue, softly pulsing, shaped like an eclipse. "I had this made," he said quietly. "It's a bond token. Not a binding. Nothing formal. Just something to wear. To remember." Elara blinked. "It links to mine," he added. "You'll always feel where I am. Not magically invasive, I promise." I had it double-checked by Orion and aggressively approved by Josie. She took it in her hand, heart suddenly, wildly full. "You're asking me to stay," she said. "I'm asking if I can stay with you." She nodded, wordless. "Then, you already have." That night, as snow fell over Frostspire and the world outside their little sanctuary began the long process of healing, Elara and Rowan lay curled together beneath a woven quilt, the stars watching silently from beyond the warded glass. Not everything was fixed. But everything was possible. And for once, that was more than enough. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, give it a like and subscribe for more beautiful tales. Tap the next thumbnail to continue your journey.